What's up and welcome to another episode of Gizmo Slip Tech. This is the Ryzen 9955HX3D laptop, the Neo 16, and I was able to test the Intel 275HX version with a 5090 back in Thailand about a week ago, and this is the 5080 version. And we're going to see how it performs against the Intel 275HX with the RTX 5090. So this isn't going to be exactly an apples to apples comparison. Now the Intel 275HX and the RTX 5090 had a water cooler attached for the entirety of the test. This was done entirely on air. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, performance should be very similar whether you're on air or on water with this laptop, but if you're on the water cooler, you don't need nearly as much fan noise to reach the same level of performance or the same temperature levels. You get quite a bit lower temperatures, as a matter of fact, with the water cooler, as you'll see during this test. Now, the other major difference is the new version of the Nvidia drivers that came out 2 days ago actually increases the wattage on the RTX 5080 and 5090. So this Ryzen 9955HX3D is getting about 10 more watts on average for a lot of the different tests. Now, some of them maybe it's a little bit more wattage, some of them maybe a little bit less wattage, but that's something very important to keep in mind. And I'm expecting a small bump in performance on the RTX 5090 when I retest it. In addition, I also expect the Intel 275H to improve with its performance as time goes on, as long as it gets tuned better by Intel, XMG, and Nvidia, because I think in games like Hogwarts, the Intel 275HX was pulling too low of wattage, causing severe CPU bounding, as you'll see in the upcoming benchmark. So take these results with a grain of salt, knowing that the Intel and 5090 version are likely to see performance bumps here in the future when I retest the system. But for now, I think we can conclusively say that at least one of these chips is better for CPU bounding and 1% low performance. So let's get into the benchmarks. Here we go. All right, so we're gonna start out with TimeSpy, and notice that the RTX 5080 is pulling the full 175 watts. It actually pulled 180 watts there at the beginning of the launch. Don't expect that. Sometimes the GPU kind of ramps extra high, but on average here, we're getting anywhere from 5 to 10, 15 watts more on the RTX 5080. And subsequently, we should also see slightly higher boost clocks compared to when it was pulling less wattage on the previous drivers. Now, I don't expect it to be a huge performance bump. As a matter of fact, in TimeSpy and other synthetic tests, you may not see any performance bump. In particular, in games though, I'm hoping, I don't know, 2, 3, 4% performance bump. I'm hoping, but maybe it's not even going to be that much, or maybe it'll be a lot, because certain games like Hogwarts was really struggling to pull the full wattage, at least on the Intel and 5090. So it's pretty clear that the 5080 at this point, now that the new drivers have dropped, we're pulling the full wattage, which is great to see. Let's take a quick look at some of the specs here. Now, the Ryzen, you can see, is pulling about 70 to 75 watts on the CPU. The Intel is only pulling 45 watts. Look at those temperatures on the CPU and GPU as well, in the 50s with the water cooler. It's especially low because, again, the Intel is not pulling as much wattage as it probably should be in this test. And on the XMG Neo 16, we're on max fans and pulling very decent wattage, and we're hitting mid 70s for the GPU, low 80s for the CPU, very good temperatures all around, and a combined GPU TDP load of about 250, whereas on the Intel, the combined load is only about 235, 240. So definitely 10 to 15, 20 more watts going through the AMD and 5080 version. Now, I've got an RTX 5090 with the HX3D being mailed to me, so we're going to be able to get an actual head-to-head with a 5090 and the Intel 275 versus 9955HX3D soon, probably next week when I get back. In addition, Asus is sending me the 9955HX and HX3D version of the Strix series. So we're going to get side-by-side CPU benchmarks there as well. So here we can see the 5090 is 17.4% ahead, and the Intel on the CPU only score is 22.9% ahead. Now, this is TimeSpy. And this, I think, is a great example of why you should not use the CPU test in TimeSpy as a measurement for CPU bound game performance, because it's not going to be very representative of real world gaming. But the GPU score, as you'll see, is pretty dang close. Not perfect, but oftentimes a lot of the games out there that are GPU bound are getting around that 15, 17, 18% mark, for the 5090 being in the lead. So next up, we have Baldur's Gate 3. Settings are on Ultra, DLSS on Quality, and there is no frame generation support here. Out of the gate, you can see that we're averaging almost the same FPS, 270 on both systems. 1% lows are actually a little better on Intel right at the beginning here. As we continue on, you can see that the 5080 is pulling almost 20 watts more than the 5090 with these new drivers. And so again, I'm expecting the 5090 to boost higher in the upcoming tests. 1% lows are pretty dang close. The wattage pull on the Intel is proper. We're getting 80, 90 watts on the Intel, 65 watts on the Ryzen, and we're getting excellent performance on both machines, with 1% lows being very close within variability and retesting range of one another. The frame time graphs are also looking excellent on both. The 5090 in this test only comes out about 4% ahead of the 5080, and I think this is largely due to the much higher wattage pull of that 5080. In addition, the 9955HX3 just barely beats out the Intel 275HX in 1% lows, only by about 3%. So next up, we have Counter-Strike 2 on the benchmark here. First settings, we're doing very high side by side, and you can see that the RTX 5090 is pretty much consistently getting just a little bit more FPS. And you can also see that the GPU over here is getting about 98%, 99% utilization as well. So we're very GPU bound in Counter-Strike 2 when you're on very high settings and with no upscaling right now. So that's very important to keep in mind. Now, I did also test low settings on the 9955HX3D so that I can see what that performance is like, but we don't have that test for the RTX 5090. So we'll just have to see what the results are for the 9955HX3D. At the end here, you can see that we got 280.6 FPS on the 5090, 242.6 on the 5080. Obviously excellent FPS on either system, but the X3D chip provided 6 additional FPS for a gain of 4.1% over the Intel chip. Here's a quick benchmark on low. You can see that we're hitting the 600 to 700 FPS range. Even when we're going through smoke, it's staying above 500 FPS pretty much nonstop. Now this is on low at QHD resolution with FSR set to balance. So we're using a little bit of upscaling to boost our FPS, and we're using lower settings to really maximize our responsiveness on the display. And you can see at the end of the benchmark, we got 635.9 FPS and 230 for a 1% low. So you can easily reach the 300 Hertz refresh rate on the XMG Neo 16 at QHD in Counter-Strike 2, but you probably have to be some kind of mixture of medium to high settings if you want to do that. Next up, we have Cyberpunk 2077, and I'm just going to pause it here. This is ultra settings with ray tracing set to ultra, DLSS on quality with 2x frame gen enabled. And you can see that we have 168 watts on the 5080 and 153 watts on the 5090. Again, driver updates I'm hoping will get us closer to matching the wattage on the 5080 and 5090 in an upcoming retest that I'm going to do. Now, we also test 4x frame gen here in a moment. I also want to point out that the average FPS here is just a little bit bugged. All right, so I didn't actually tap it here until just a moment, but you can see that the current FPS graph 113 versus 131. We're getting very good performance and a nice performance gap between the 5090 and 5080 in this very GPU bound focused game test, because ray tracing is enabled, frame generation is enabled, and as you'll see with 4x frame gen, it actually increases the performance gap between the 5090 and the 5080 by just a little bit. So, and keep in mind that these GPUs are not overclocked at all in any of these tests, Time Spy or game testing. So this is all stock for some eventual comparison versus overclocking that I'm going to be doing on these laptops as well. So I also want to point out, look at what the Intel CPU is pulling, 84 watts on that CPU, the Ryzen pulling 62 watts. So when the Intel chip is being properly tuned for a game, it's oftentimes pulling about 80 watts. Wow, it is thundering here in Taiwan, Taipei. It is coming down. All right, so hopefully you guys don't mind a little bit of thunder in the background. Okay. So, yes, well, it's also interesting. Look at that VRAM utilization. On this one, we're getting 8 gigs of VRAM, 9.7 gigs of VRAM utilized on the 5090. That's interesting. All right, so 137 FPS for the 5090, 119 for the 5080. But look at our 1% lows that we measured. 56 with the Intel CPU, 100 for the 9955HX3D, which is a 79% gain for 1% lows. Absolutely crazy, and definitely something that you'd probably be able to feel in gameplay, because just those little 1% low stutters are going to make a difference in your gameplay. Now, I mean, it's still going to be very smooth on the Intel, don't get me wrong, but it's going to be just extra buttery smooth on the X3D chip. So now we're going to test it with 4x multi-frame generation, and a multi-frame generation is something that I think a lot of gamers are going to use in single-player games in particular, but know that you can get multi-frame generation on even the RTX 3000 and 2000 series using extra tools like lossless scaling. That's a tool that you can enable multi-frame generation, but I don't think it's going to quite have the latency that the Nvidia version of multi-frame generation has. With multi-frame generation, we're hitting 240 FPS with the 5090, about 200 FPS with the 5080, averaging 232 and 207 respectively. But again, look at those 1% lows on the 9955HX3D. I also want to point out that the frame time graph on the Intel version appears to be a little bit bugged, which does draw some concern that this 1% low number might also be a little bit bugged. I don't think it is, but the frame time graph does appear to be bugged. I do want to point that out. So also the wattage pull right now, about 60 or so watts on both the Intel or AMD chip. So that's pretty interesting as well, that the wattage pull on the CPU went down when we did multi-frame generation. Also, look at that water cooling. The water cooler, 55 degrees and 66 and 75.87 for the CPU GPU temps. Huge difference when you add that water cooler. Plus 18% to the 5090, plus 188% for the 9955HX3D. Pretty insane performance improvement for the Ryzen 1% lows. All right, next game is Oblivion. Now, we again can see a big difference in the TDP on the 5090 and 5080, and again, a huge difference on those 1% lows, 108 versus 55. And we're talking a pretty huge difference here. 18% increase average FPS for the 5090, 96% increase 1% lows for the 55HX3D. Very impressive 1% low performance, and the 5090 having a pretty large gap between the 5080 and 5090 in terms of average FPS. Very interesting. All right, so here is God of War, 130 FPS right now on the 5090, 113 on the 5080. 1% low actually appears to be in favor of Intel here. I think it's because it's such a GPU-bound game. The CPU really does not have to get hit that hard here, but the 275HX actually takes the cake for both average FPS and 1% lows. 16% average FPS gain and 20% 1% lows goes to Intel. So very good performance in God of War. Here's Hogwarts, and here is where Intel, I think, is super bugged and poorly optimized. And I think Intel, XMG, and Nvidia really need to get together and fix the optimization here on the Intel CPU. Because you can see we're only pulling 54 watts, and all these other games are pulling higher levels of wattages, in particular when we're CPU bound. So I think we should be pulling more like 80 to 100 watts on this Intel chip. And so as a result, we're getting very bad performance on Intel. But the performance on this Ryzen 9955HX3D and RTX 5080 is the most I've ever seen in Hogwarts. And this is an Unreal 4 engine game. So, you know, a lot of games are built on Unreal Engine. So I'm anticipating the 9955HX3D is going to just do really well in all these Unreal Engine games and have really good 1% low performance as well as really good average performance. Because if you look at the GPU utilization as we do this test, we're in above 90% versus the Intel chips only at 58%, though typically it is more like 70-80% on the 14900HX, so it's usually better than that. But the interesting part to me is that I didn't even have to run through the city one time before doing the test on the HX3D chip, and we had excellent performance. Like, it was phenomenal. And it was just the smoothest I've ever seen Hogwarts being played on any laptop I've ever tested. So here is DLSS quality, ultra preset with ultra ray tracing with 4x frame gen enabled on both systems. And look at that 1% low performance on Intel, 21. So some noticeable stuttering still occurring on the Intel system, where the AMD system is crushing it. Absolutely crushing it. 170 watts to the GPU, 95% GPU utilization, 149 average FPS for Intel and the 5090 versus 277 FPS average on the AMD chip with the 5080. So with the 5090 and the HX3D chip, I'm anticipating 300 FPS in Hogwarts for the first time. Of course, a lot of these are AI generated fake frames, and they're not the same quality. And honestly, I wouldn't play with 4x frame gen on this game because it does cause visual artifacting that can be really annoying around the player's legs and stuff. But the higher the FPS, the less artifacting that occurs. So maybe at the 277 FPS, it actually is playable without as much artifact. So I'd have to do some more testing. But on the Intel system, the 4x multi-frame gen, it just wasn't enough. Here we have Marvel Rivals, an esports game, and we're starting out with ultra preset, DLSS on quality, and no frame gen. And we do incorporate some multi-frame gen here tests as well. So looking at the wattage pull, 153 versus 163 between the 5090 and 5080. And the CPU wattage pull is about the same in the 60 or so watts range. GPU utilization is very good on both systems, above 95% most of the time. And average FPS is a clear lead for the 5090 over the 5080. And as you'll see, now, the RTX 5090 has a 6% lead here on ultra settings, and the 9955HX has a 14% lead. So it's interesting that you're getting better averages on the 5090, but on the Ryzen chip, you're getting better 1% lows, which sometimes can be more important when you're doing Twitch shooters. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we flip on 4 times frame gen on the ultra preset with DLSS on quality. So you could definitely go over 300 FPS on either system if you were to switch it to low and multi-frame gen. Now, I don't recommend playing esports games with frame gen enabled because it does increase the latency on the laptop. But look at the 1% low performance on Intel versus Ryzen here, 50 FPS approximately to 160 FPS for the Ryzen. I mean, it's such a buttery smooth experience on the Ryzen. We get literally a 3 times uplift on 1% lows with the HX3D chip. That's huge. Average FPS going to the 5090 though. So I can't wait to test the 5090 with the HX3D because it's probably going to be the best performance that I've ever seen on a laptop. Now here is low settings with DLSS on quality and no frame generation in the mix here. So you can see the 5090 has a pretty clear lead in this situation. So here you can see the 5090 has a clear lead, and without frame generation in the mix, the 1% lows are also much better on Intel. Now, the tricky part again, I don't know if this is bugged, because this is an example where 1% lows get a lot better when you turn off frame gen with Intel. So maybe that's just what you got to do right now, or maybe just the data that's being reported here is bugged. 210 FPS versus 193, and then the 275HX with no frame gen actually does take 1% low performance here with plus 15.7% in Marvel Rivals on low, no frame gen. So it's interesting that the HX3D seems to play better with frame gen in the mix than the Intel chip. Okay, so Monster Hunter Wilds, a very poorly overall optimized game, and you really got to have a massively powerful system to run this game well. And you can see that the RTX 5090 here has a noticeable lead, despite having a lower wattage pull with the older drivers and the Intel chip. Now, look at that wattage pull on the Intel chip. It was 95 watts, 80 watts on the CPU, 90 watts right now. And the Ryzen chip doing 51, 52 watts. That is really good optimization from AMD that we're able to get just as high of GPU utilization on much lower wattage pull on the AMD chassis. And I think that's kind of what Intel was trying to do by limiting the package power pull on the other games like Hogwarts. They wanted it to be really efficient, but it sadly wasn't enough to actually get good 1% low performance, and it ended up even inhibiting the average FPS in their games. So I would really encourage Intel to look at the power pole and be very careful when they limit the wattage down lower, so that way it doesn't choke out the GPU's performance. Look at that 1% low performance. Intel doing 66 on average right now and 75 for the Ryzen HX3D. So even though it has a lower average, the HX3D's 1% low performance is still better. This is clearly not a bug scenario. So this is a really great example where I think you're gonna get noticeably better 1% low performance on the HX3D. I don't think it's necessarily always gonna be like 200% better like what we saw in Marvel Rivals, because that number might be bugged. This number definitely is not bugged. And we're getting better 1% low performance on a lower power GPU or a lower tier GPU. Technically it's a higher power because it's 170 watts versus 153 watts with the new drivers. So again, retesting, and take this data with a grain of salt. And don't take this to the bank entirely just yet, but 1% low performance I think should be pretty reliably in the HX3D's camp. It's just going to be too much of a gap, I think, for Intel to be able to overcome. Next up, we have The Witcher 3. Ultra quality preset, ray tracing on ultra, DLSS on quality, frame generation is enabled, so we're looking to hit at least 90 FPS to have a great smooth experience. And we're talking 130 approximate FPS, 122 right now for the 5080. Notice the power pull is a lot better on the 5080, again, because of the driver update. The CPU wattage, though, is about the same between the two, and we're still hitting GPU utilization above 95%. So generally going to be GPU bound here, and getting excellent performance in both. 135 for the 5090, 126 for the 5080, and a clear lead for the 5090 for average FPS, and the 275HX actually wins the 1% low performance as well at a slight plus 3%. On average, the 58 is actually a 0.5% faster because of the outlier of Hogwarts here. And so as a result, I did do another graph of this with the Hogwarts data removed, which I think is more valid to take a look at. So let's take a look at that. On average, the 5090 is 12.1% faster when you take out the Hogwarts anomalous data, though, I mean, it's real data. The 5090, a clear lead. I'd say most GPU-bound game scenarios, the 5090 is gonna be around 15 to 18% faster. So I really wanna see, like, what is a HX3D with a 5080 and an HX3D with a 5090. What does that look like in terms of GPU performance comparison? Because it's more valid than, say, Intel versus HX3D, because that really muddles the difference here. Now, let's also take a look at 1% lows, because that's very important when you're considering game smoothness. Now, when averaging 1% lows across all of these games, you're looking at a 42% advantage for the HX3D, even though Intel did beat the HX3D in some of the 1% lows. And I think part of that is when the game is very GPU bound, the 5090 is just going to outperform the 5080, and therefore, 1% lows is usually just a fraction of the total. So part of that is like, let's see what the Intel 275HX with a 5090 versus HX3D with a 5090 will actually look like later on. So, but it's just amazing to me that with a 5080 and with a better CPU, we're getting 42% faster 1% lows. Now, when you take out Hogwarts, one of the greatest outliers, again, you're looking at a 31.5% faster 1% low performance with the HX3D. So pretty noticeable. So if you had these two laptops side by side, I think you could actually physically see that the HX3D is a smoother gaming experience. There's less stutters happening on average. And that's with a lower equipped 5080 paired with the HX3D. I can't wait to see what a 5090 with the HX3D can do. So if you don't want to miss that test, be sure to subscribe. And if you want to see more videos, and if you enjoyed this comparison, please hit the like button. I'll see you in the next one. Brandon out.